Again, this is not so directly connected to the climate itself, but obviously we cannot make a good, complete story without worrying about what a modern mind means and when it evolved or how it evolved. And of course, the deeper questions about what is even human, what is modern human, and what makes us different than animals are all kind of questions. Evolution of consciousness and so on are all very interesting topics, but they go a little too far. Just sticking to the Scientific American Becoming Human book, this is the Mourning of the Modern Mind. Controversial discoveries suggest that the roots of our vaunted intellect run far deeper than is commonly believed. There is the word vaunted again, something to be boasted about or something to be envied. Personal adornment with jewelry and body paint may have started far earlier than previously thought. Early indications of such symbolic use, believed by many archaeologists to be a key component of modern human behavior, include 75,000-year-old shell beads from Blombo's cave in South Africa. So these are deliberately put on and designed and worn and indicate, some thinking, whether that is modern or whether that's more evolved thinking and so on, obviously have to be taken with a grain of salt, because many fish, many birds and so on evolve colors to camouflage themselves. There is mimicry, where the butterflies will mimic patterns of a poisonous butterfly without producing the poison, without spending the energy to produce the poison, but they can scare away the predators with the same colors and so on and so forth. So evolution is complicated. Nonetheless, snail shells were collected from an estuary 12 miles away from Blombo's cave and then pierced with an awl. Where marks around the holes indicate that they were strung together to create perhaps a necklace or a bracelet. So sense of beauty, sense of attracting mates with ornaments may have evolved, but there are birds who do this as well. Birds of passion do all kinds of song and dance, literally song and dance, and they collect trinkets to attract a mate and so on and so forth. So sexual reproduction is expensive in the sense either the male or the female has to spend a lot of energy to find the mate to propagate the genes, as opposed to just replicating like bacteria. But why is sexual reproduction evolutionarily stable? Because of this idea of recombination that we talked about, which can select beneficial mutations or produce beneficial mutations with recombinations. So the overview of evolved thinking is that archaeologists have traditionally envisioned Homo sapiens becoming modern of mind quickly and recently, sometime in the past 50,000 years, more than 100,000 years after attaining anatomical modernity in terms of standing up, brain evolution, brain size, and pharynx and so on. New discoveries in Africa indicate that many of the elements of modern human behavior can be traced much further back in time. These things will keep changing as new evidences are found. The finds suggest that our species had a keen intellect at its inception and exploited that creativity in archaeologically visible ways only when it was advantageous to do so. We don't know what the advantage here in that sense, but obviously, and the population size increased, these things can become advantageous in terms of selecting or getting selected in a big crowd, how to stand out in a crowd. Homo sapiens may not have been the only hominid to possess such advanced cognition. Some artifacts hint that Neanderthals were comparably gifted in these. So looking at Stone Age sophistication, archaeological discoveries in Africa have revealed that elements of modern human behavior can be traced back far beyond the 40,000 year mark above. Contrary to earlier claims based on European record. But experts agree that many more people routinely engaged in these practices after the date than before it. So the number of people engaged in this practice may have increased after 40,000 years. A number of hypotheses for what set the stage for this tipping point, not all of which are mutually exclusive, have been put forth below, so we'll look at that. So here, go back to 500,000 years ago. Older one and older technologies, so blades which have existed throughout with some so there is a non-linear scale here, so you have to be careful. Grindstones discovered way back before about 300,000 years and still survive, making chutney in India, for example. Pigment processing still survives for clothes dyeing, artistry and other things, painting. Points, shell fishing, long distance exchange, fishing, notational pieces incised, so you can see they still exist. Bone tools still used in some hunter-gatherers like the hata, I think. Mining, barbed points, microliths, beads and images. Okay, so over time Stone Age sophistication has grown from Paleolithic times to Mesolithic and Neolithic times into Iron and Bronze Age as well. So symbolism, looking at a few things that we mentioned here. The invention of external storage of information, whether in jewelry, art, language or tools, was the watershed event in modern human behavioral evolution, according to Christopher Henshelwood of the University of Bergen, Norway. Homo sapiens probably had the hardware required for symbolic thought by the time the species arose, at least 195,000 years ago. Sapiens became prevalent around 200,000 years ago. Hence, the occasional early glimpses of it in the archaeological record. But only once symbolism became the basis for human behavioral organization, resulting in the formation of trade and alliance networks, for example, was its full potential realized. Ecological disaster. Genetic data suggests that Homo sapiens experienced a bottleneck of some 70,000 years ago. We talked about genetic and geographical bottlenecks, physical bottlenecks. Stanley H. Ambrose of the University of Illinois posits that it was the fallout from an eruption of Sumatra's Mount Toba at around that time that may have brought on a devastating 6-year-long volcanic winter and subsequent 1,000-year ice age. Volcanoes have played a role later on as well, and they still continue to play a role, but not at such a long period of time. Those individuals who cooperated and shared resources with one another beyond their local group boundaries were the best equipped to survive in the harsh environs and pass their genes along to the next generation. The extreme conditions favored a transition from the troop level of social organization to that of a tribe. So this is obviously a hypothesis there as well. Projectile technology, the innovation of projectile weapons between 45,000 and 35,000 years ago allowed humans to kill large game. You can shoot from far and hunt as a group, and even whales, for example, and other humans from a safe distance. So war would have started, fighting would have been more efficient for killing the enemy from far. This says John Shea of Stony Brook University, provided people with a strong incentive to cooperate, which would in turn have fostered the development of social networks through which information could be really shared. Of course, now social networks have taken a new meaning in terms of social media and how information gets distributed, distorted, tailored, created, modified, and so on. Population growth. Modern ways bubbled up and disappeared at different times and in different places until the population size reached critical mass. At that point, confrontation between groups and competition for resources sparked symbolic behavior and spurred technological innovation, contend researchers, including Alison Brooks of George Washington University and Sally McBrearty of the University of Connecticut on the East Coast. And with more people to pass on these traditions, they began to stick rather than dying out with the last member of a group. This happens even now in terms of lost art and craft and expertise and so on. Brain mutation, a genetic mutation roughly 50,000 years ago had the lucky effect of rewiring the human brain such that it was capable of symbolic thought, including language, argue Richard G. Klein of Stanford University. Humans carrying this mutation had a considerable advantage over those who did not and quickly outcompeted and replaced them. There are accidental elimination of genes as well, like humans remain the only primate with no bone in the penis, which is supposed to have been lost accidentally, for example. Mapping modernity. Humans who looked like us had evolved by 195,000 years ago, as evidenced by Homo sapiens fossils from the site of Homo Kibish in Ethiopia, but received archaeological wisdom holds that humans did not begin behaving like us until nearly 150,000 years later. That notion stems largely from cultural remains uncovered in Europe, and where art, ritual, technological advances and other indications of modern thinking flowered spectacularly and suddenly after 40,000 years ago, around the time that anatomically modern humans started colonizing Europe. Recent finds, including those from Blombos Cave in South Africa, are revealing that many sophisticated practices emerged long before 40,000 years ago at sites outside of Europe, suggesting that humans were our cognitive equals by the time they attained anatomical modernity, if not earlier. Indeed, the fact that at least some Neanderthals appear to have thought symbolically raises the possibility that such capacities were present in the last common ancestors of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. The map below shows the locations of the sites mentioned in this article. So this is a map looking at various things. I'm not sure I'll go through all the details, but oldest evidence of painting in Africa from Apollo 11 rock shelter in Namibia 28,000 years ago. Neanderthal made pierced tooth from France 33,000 years old. There is something from 33,000 years old here, 30 to 35,000 years in Germany, 400 kilo year in Germany as well. That depends on what you are looking at. So earliest anatomically modern Homo sapiens physical remains found here. Known and presumed Homo sapiens cultural remains found in these red dots here. We will talk, and we have talked several times about the late arrival here as opposed to earlier arrivals elsewhere in Eurasia. Neanderthal cultural remains over here in colder climates, and older human cultural remains here in these orangish things 400 kilo years ago, for example, and 200 kilo years ago here. Okay, so a smattering of various time scales of various sophistications, and this is looking at ivory waterbird, among the earliest pieces of figurative art known from Hohlfels cave, I don't know how it's pronounced, in Germany 30 to 35,000 years ago. Scraped heat-treated red ochre, possibly used in ritualistic burial act from Qafzeh cave in Israel, 92,000 years old. Bone harpoon from Katanda in the Democratic Republic of Congo, 80,000 years old. Here is another one, ostrich eggshell bead from Loyangalani in Tanzania, perhaps 70,000 years old. Even in Australia, Malakunja, 50 to 60,000 years ago, and Nawalabida, Australia, 50 to 60 kilo years ago. If you know the pronunciation better than me, please go ahead and tell me. This is a Blombos ochre engraved with a stone point, may reflect record keeping or a design aesthetic. So whether this is an accounting technique or just some aesthetic thing. The effort required to prepare the substrate and produce markings suggests a premeditated act rather than doodling, so some planning may be involved. This is just a Blombos cave, which was a veritable Garden of Eden when humans lived there 75,000 years ago. Discoverer Christopher Henshelwood says that freshwater springs burbled at the base of the cliff, and the bounty of the sea lay in the backyard. Tasty eland and other antelope roamed the area, and the climate was about as mild as it is today, so there is the climate angle. Henshelwood and his team have been digging in the cave's Middle Stone Age deposits since 1997, carefully recording the location of each artifact unearthed. Just to mention, there have been some cheating, unethical behavior in some parts of the world where fossils were planted and datelines were cheated on, changed, and so on and so forth. Tools from Blombos are more sophisticated than those typically found at Middle Stone Age sites. The bone implements include awls worked to a fine point and polished with ochre to achieve a smooth patina. This is the last one, I think. Symbolic behavior may not have originated in Europe, but its early record there is rich, just in terms of numbers of records found. Chauvert Cave in an Ardèche region of France, Ardèche is the French pronunciation, I'm sure, contains oldest cave paintings in the world. Its galleries showcase a menagerie of Ice Age creatures, including lions here, rendered in ochre 35,000 years ago. Ancient Europeans also had a love of music tools, as evidenced by this 32,000-year-old bone flute from Lustritz in France, and they buried their dead with sometimes breathtaking ceremony, as seen above in the replica of a 20,000-year-old burial of 2 children and 1,000 beads of other grave goods from Sanjir in Russia. We looked at both of these things in the last podcast, but nonetheless, you get the idea that we have tried to date the mourning of the modern mind without explicitly saying what the modern mind is, but generally corresponds to creating aesthetic, artistic, maybe useful accounting type artifacts which are found archaeologically, and their timings vary, but European sites would say 45,000 years would have been the mourning of the modern mind, but Eurasian sites say maybe they are older, and maybe not just Homo sapiens, but our relatives like Neanderthals were also good at many of these modern mind kind of evidences left behind. Does that relate to evolved thinking? Well, potentially, because many of the decorations, paintings, face paintings, beads, etc. may be about dealing with population increases to find mates by standing out, and so on and so forth. So obviously these are interpretations and hypotheses as well, so you have to be careful about that. Okay.